Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we are diving headfirst into a pretty major development, I'd say, sending shockwaves through global trade. We're talking about the newly announced 2025 U.S. tariffs and the reactions that are coming in for all corners of the world. Now you're here, you're listening because you want to cut through the noise and get a clear and comprehensive understanding of what's actually happening.
Right.
And that is exactly what we're here to do.
Absolutely.
We've gone through a whole bunch of sources for you. News reports, expert analyses, official statements, you name it. And we've kind of distilled it all down to bring you the core of this evolving story.
Exactly.
Really, our mission here today is pretty straightforward. We want to unravel the reasoning behind these tariffs, explore how the world is reacting to them, and analyze the potential economic impacts, both for the U.S. and for the global economy as a whole.
Right.
And we want to do this without getting bogged down in too much jargon.
Absolutely. This is a crucial point in international trade. And I think, the sheer volume of information out there can be overwhelming. We've done the legwork to pull out the essential points, give you a clear and well-rounded perspective.
Okay, so let's get into this. The core of this new policy is a sweeping 10% tariff that's going to apply to pretty much all goods coming into the United States.
Right.
But it goes beyond that. The administration has also signaled that they could slap much higher tariffs. We're talking up to 50%.
Wow.
On specific countries.
Okay.
Now, the stated goals here, according to the Trump administration, they're pretty clear. They want to punish countries that they see as having unfair trade practices. They want to reduce the U.S. trade deficit.
Right.
Now, for those who aren't familiar with that term, that basically means that the U.S. is importing more goods and services than it's exporting.
Right.
And they also want to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. and boost government revenue through these tariffs. And this is not some far-off plan. This is happening now.
Right.
The universal 10% tariff actually just went into effect this past Saturday, April 5th. At those higher country-specific tariffs. They could kick in as early as Wednesday, April 9th.
That's fast.
It's a very fast turnaround. And I think what's interesting is the speed and the sweeping nature of these changes.
Right.
Because a near universal tariff on imports is a huge departure from the norms in global trade.
Yeah.
And I think if we connect this to the bigger picture, it really suggests a potential fundamental shift in how the U.S. is approaching international commerce.
Right.
And the world is definitely paying attention.
Yeah.
The responses from the countries have been largely negative. Ranging from concern to, outright alarm.
Right.
The president of the European Commission, for example, he expressed deep concern and even hinted at the possibility of countermeasures. So, it's not all doom and gloom, though. Not every country is immediately threatening retaliation.
Right.
We've seen initial responses from countries like India and Taiwan that suggest they don't have plans for reciprocal tariffs right now.
Okay.
But here's what I find really telling. Over 50 countries have already reportedly contacted the White House to start trade talks.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. And Vietnam has actually requested a delay in the implementation of these tariffs.
Interesting.
Over 50 countries. I mean, what does that tell you about the immediate global impact or even just the perceived threat of these tariffs?
That just really underscores how interconnected the global economy really is. Even the countries that aren't immediately saying they're going to retaliate, they're clearly feeling the heat, and they want to figure out what this new landscape means for them and for their own economies. The fact that so many are scrambling to start negotiations suggests that there's a widespread understanding that these tariffs could have a serious impact.
And the statements coming out of the UK have been particularly striking. The UK Prime Minister has warned that the world as we knew it has gone.
Wow.
And a UK minister actually said that we've reached the end of globalization as we knew it.
That's pretty dramatic.
It is. And it suggests maybe a really profound reshaping of global trade relationships.
Right.
Now, on a slightly different note, Elon Musk, he's offered a kind of hopeful perspective.
Okay.
He's expressed that he would like to see a zero tariff situation. Which, stands in a pretty stark contrast to these dire warnings. Does this highlight maybe a difference in how different people see the future of global trade?
Right.
And then adding another layer to all this, we're hearing that the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is planning to go to Washington specifically to discuss these tariffs.
Interesting.
And that same UK minister also made an interesting point. He said that the UK might be treated differently to the EU because of Brexit.
Okay.
So it seems like the existing political dynamics are also influencing how these tariffs are being perceived and potentially how they might be applied.
Those statements from the UK are really striking, I think.
Yeah.
They suggest that this isn't just some minor tweak to trade policy,
Right.
but a potential turning point with really far-reaching consequences. It really begs the question, are we seeing the beginning of a new era of protectionism?
Yeah.
Or is this a calculated move by the U.S. to gain leverage in trade negotiations on a global scale?
So while there's all this international concern,
Right.
the Trump administration is actually painting a pretty optimistic picture of how these tariffs will impact things here at home, specifically for American consumers.
Right.
Top officials like Kevin Hassett and Peter Navarro, they're arguing that these tariffs won't really hurt American consumers in any significant way.
Okay, interesting.
Their reasoning is that foreign countries will basically have to eat the cost by lowering their prices because the U.S. market is just too important. Navarro said it pretty plainly. He said they have to be here. So they're saying these countries will be forced to absorb the tariff rather than risk losing access to American buyers.
I see.
Hassett even went so far as to say that he doesn't expect a big effect on the consumer in the U.S.
Okay, so this argument relies on the idea of inelastic supply, which is something Hassett mentioned.
Right.
And it basically means that there's a limit to how much these countries can easily reduce their production or, shift their goods to other markets in the short term. So if the U.S. is a huge buyer, like they are, these countries might not have a lot of wiggle room.
Right.
It's fascinating that the administration thinks that these foreign producers can't really cut back production that easily.
Yeah.
And that they rely on the U.S. market so heavily that they'll basically just accept the cost of the tariff.
Yeah. They're also pointing to past examples of what they call dumping goods.
Right.
Which is when a country sells goods in a foreign market at a price that's lower than their domestic price, or even below their cost of production, they're using that to say that these countries have room to lower prices without hurting their profits too much.
I see.
And Hassett's point about, over 50 countries scrambling to get into trade talks because they understand that they bear a lot of the tariff.
Right.
That's really central to this whole optimistic outlook from the administration.
Yeah, it's a pretty bold claim, for sure.
But not everyone is buying into this rosy picture.
Right.
There are some serious concerns and criticisms about the potential downsides here. And former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, he is one of the most vocal critics. He strongly disagrees with this idea that everything's going to be fine.
Okay.
He's warning about increased inflation, which basically means higher prices for everything.
Right. Everyday goods.
Exactly. And that would reduce how much American consumers can actually buy.
Right. Purchasing power.
Exactly. And could even lead to job losses. Summers went so far as to call these tariffs the biggest self-inflicted wound we've put on our economy in history.
Wow. That's
strong words.
Yeah.
He's suggesting that we could see big drops in company value and a decline in overall consumer well-being. And then you have major retailers. They're predicting that prices are going to go up almost immediately once these tariffs hit.
Makes sense.
And let's not forget about the stock market. Global markets took a pretty significant dip after the tariff announcement.
Oh, yeah.
Summers pointed this out and said it was the fourth largest two-day market move since World War II.
Wow.
Which he sees as the very troubling sign of potential economic turmoil.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, this contrast in predictions, I think, really shows how much uncertainty there is around these tariffs.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Summers' focus on potential inflation.
Right.
I think that's a key concern for a lot of economists.
Yeah.
If the cost of imported goods goes up because of the tariffs, it's very likely that those higher costs are going to be passed on to consumers. Higher prices for everyone.
And the market reaction you mentioned suggests that investors are worried about the potential impact on company earnings and overall economic growth.
Right. So with all this potential economic pain looming, what's the administration's plan to counter that?
Right. Good question.
Well, they're saying that a new tax bill is coming.
Okay.
And that's going to offset any negative effects.
Interesting.
Officials like Navarro and Hassett,
yeah,
they're suggesting that this bill will basically extend the 2017 tax cuts.
Okay.
and could include some new goodies like potentially getting rid of taxes on tips.
Interesting.
They're saying this will help soften the blow of any price increases that happen because of the tariffs.
Okay.
Hassett in particular seems really confident about this.
Mm-hmm.
He said he believes this will be the biggest, most pro-worker tax cut in history.
Okay.
And that it'll pass this summer and outweigh any little blips we might see from the tariffs.
So the idea here is to use, fiscal policy tax cuts to try to balance out the potential negative effects of the trade policy. What's interesting to me is the timing and the potential size of these cuts. Because if they're big enough, they could put more money in people's pockets. But as you mentioned, there's some intrigue because this tax bill is tied up in all those discussions about the budget and the debt ceiling in Congress. So whether it actually passes and what it looks like in the end could be very different from what they're talking about now.
Now let's talk about the Federal Reserve.
Okay.
Because it's always kind of connected to economic policy.
Right.
President Trump has been pretty vocal about wanting lower interest rates.
Yeah.
But Hassett is denying that these tariffs are a way to pressure the Fed into lowering rates. He says there's no political coercion happening.
Okay.
But here's where it gets a little interesting. President Trump retweeted a social media post that suggested the market drop was actually intentional to force the Fed's hand.
Okay.
Which seems to contradict what Hassett's saying. Right. And it suggests that at least some people in the administration think these actions might be connected.
Yeah.
But Hassett insists that the tariffs are a long-standing policy goal and have nothing to do with the Fed.
Okay.
Even if there's no direct coercion. Do you think the potential for inflation caused by these tariffs could indirectly influence the Fed's decisions about interest rates in the coming months?
That back and forth between trade policy and monetary policy is always worth watching.
Right.
Hassett's saying publicly that there's no attempt to coerce the Fed.
Yeah.
But that retweet from the president adds another layer to the story. It raises the question, even if the tariffs weren't designed to sway the Fed, could their economic impact unintentionally push the central bank to change its interest rate policy?
Now, here's a curious detail. Russia seems to be excluded from that initial list of countries facing these tariffs.
Yeah, that's interesting.
When Kevin Hassett was asked about this, he said that the U.S. is currently in negotiations with both Russia and Ukraine. And he said that they didn't want to conflate the tariff issue with these sensitive peace negotiations.
Interesting.
Hassett did suggest that Russia might be treated differently in the fullest of time.
Okay.
But that right now the focus is on diplomacy. This exclusion of Russia is pretty noteworthy, though, especially given how broad these tariffs are.
Right.
Hassett's explanation focusing on, not wanting to mess up delicate peace talks.
Right.
I think it shows that geopolitical factors are also at play here.
Yeah, definitely.
And that the administration is being strategic about who they target with these tariffs and when.
It highlights that trade policy isn't always just about economics.
Yeah.
It can be a tool in a larger geopolitical strategy.
Right.
The decision to leave Russia out, at least for now, while they're pointing to these sensitive negotiations, suggests that they're prioritizing diplomacy at this point.
So finally, let's step back and think about the bigger picture here.
Okay.
The scale of these tariffs and the international reactions we've been talking about, they really make you wonder if we're seeing a major shift away from the global trade order that we've been used to.
Yeah.
Remember what the UK Prime Minister and that minister said? The world as we knew it has gone, and the end of globalization as we knew it.
Right.
These are pretty powerful statements.
They are.
And they suggest a possible move towards more protectionism.
Right.
And a breaking apart of global economic ties.
Yeah.
It's almost like we're seeing a pendulum swing away from that hyperglobalization of the past few decades towards a more fragmented world order.
That's a powerful image.
Yeah.
It suggests a pretty significant reshaping of the economic landscape.
So over 50 countries are willing to enter into trade talks.
Right.
How do you interpret that?
I think that could be interpreted in a couple of ways. On the one hand, it could mean that they're trying to minimize the damage and maybe negotiate some exceptions for themselves. But on the other hand, it could also mean that they recognize that the trade landscape has fundamentally shifted.
Right.
And they're trying to navigate this new reality and maybe even reshape it.
Yeah.
The long-term consequences for things like global supply chains, international cooperation, and overall economic growth are still really uncertain.
So to sum it all up, we're seeing two very different perspectives here.
Yeah.
The Trump administration is optimistic. They say American consumers won't be seriously affected by these tariffs.
Right.
And that any short-term problems will be balanced out by those tax cuts that are coming.
Yeah.
But then you have economists and international partners
right.
who are really worried about inflation, higher prices for consumers, and major disruptions to the global economy.
The true impact of these tariffs will become clearer as time goes on.
Right.
The outcomes of those negotiations with all those countries will be a crucial factor in determining the future of global trade.
Yeah.
It's a situation with a lot of uncertainty and potentially huge consequences for everyone involved.
Exactly. And that brings us to our final thought for you to consider.
Okay.
Given these conflicting viewpoints and the very real possibility of big economic shifts, what do you think is the most likely long-term outcome of this new tariff policy, both for the U.S. and for the world?
Yeah.
What specific things will you be watching for to see which predictions actually turn out to be right?
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.